With things like speed boosters, can you really tell the difference between crop sensors and full frame cameras? Is it really worth spending the extra money on a full frame sensor in order to get what you need? I own both and I use both regularly, so in this video I'm going to try to make the case for why you definitely don't need to go full frame, but some reasons why you might. So most people want a full frame camera for the wide field of view, the shallow depth of field you're able to achieve, and the low light performance. Those are the questions that, in my opinion, need to be answered from the perspective of Micro Four Thirds, and can it stack up to what the full frame is able to do? So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the pros and cons of both crop sensors and full frames so that you can see what might be best for you. Maybe you're feeling left behind by all your favorite YouTubers who use full frame, and maybe you're just struggling with the limitations of Micro Four Thirds and you're wanting to upgrade to full frame. Or maybe you're looking at your first camera purchase and you just want to know, do you have to shell extra for the full frame, or will Micro Four Thirds or APS-C get you by? I'm also going to be showing you comparisons in identical situations between the two so that you can see if you can even tell the difference or which one you like more. And I'm going to be mainly talking from the perspective of a Micro Four Thirds because I have a GH5, and if you don't know, Micro Four Thirds is actually half the size of full frame, so that affects focal lengths. For instance, a 12mm on a Micro Four Thirds sensor is going to be the equivalent to a 24mm on a full frame sensor. So let's actually sit here and talk about that for a second, about the field of view and how that affects the different cameras. So because that 2x crop factor on a Micro Four Thirds, that will actually give you a lot more reach. So that means you have more versatility, especially when you have the ability to adapt a speed booster onto the camera. So if you don't know what a speed booster is, it's a piece of glass, it's an adapter that you can put onto your GH5 or other Micro Four Thirds camera, and that will allow you to adapt a full frame lens onto your crop sensor camera. So for instance, I have the Metabone speed booster with the Canon Sigma 18-35 attached to that. But if I'm not using the speed booster, then one of my go-to lenses is my Leica 12-60, which in full frame equivalence is the same as a 24mm to 120. So massive reach, and it's a 2.8 to 4.0 aperture. So a relatively fast lens, and which will give you some of that depth of field, blurry background. But then if you want to adapt to a full frame lens, you can get an even wider focal length than that 24. And when you use that speed booster, you can almost match the field of view to a full frame. There is a slight crop though. So now let's talk about depth of field. Now depth of field has to do with how blurry the background is compared to the subject, your ability to separate the background. And so what I have found is that a full frame camera and a Micro Four Thirds camera with the adapter gives you the equivalent depth of field. In other words, the background will be just as blurry if that's what you want. You can achieve an extremely shallow depth of field on a crop sensor when you have that speed booster attached. In fact, I would argue it's identical. You cannot tell the difference. But that's with a little bit of a caveat. Autofocus is going to be extremely important here in this case. When I'm using the speed booster, my Sigma will stop down to an f-stop of 1.1, which is extremely shallow depth of field, which means if your focus isn't locked on, then your image is going to be blurry. The depth of field almost becomes too shallow, and without autofocus, it becomes really difficult to maintain that shallow depth of field and to keep your subject in perfect focus. So this depth of field thing is a pro if you're looking for the same image, but if you're using a camera like the GH5, which does not have reliable autofocus, then you're going to have to manually focus that, keep a close eye on it, and you might miss it. In other words, you're gonna have to work twice as hard to get the same image that you could easily get on a camera with better autofocus, especially if it's full frame like my Sony a7 IV. However, cameras like the GH6 have improved autofocus and can probably manage that better if you're using the spot focus and you mess around with those autofocus settings. But when you're adapting full frame lenses to it using a speed booster, that does inhibit the autofocus capabilities a little bit. So it's not even, it even takes away more of the reliability in that case. So just something to be aware of. Keep in mind also, you don't always want an extremely shallow depth of field. I know people say that that's the cinematic look, and that does give you cinematic look if that's what you're going for, but a lot of times it can become distracting because the background almost looks fake. It almost looks like a green screen because it's that out of focus. So a shallow depth of field can be overrated at times, and it's not always necessary to get a cinematic look. Okay, so let's talk about low light. Now, the speed booster definitely allows more light to hit the sensor and thus improves the low light capabilities on a crop sensor. However, it's not as good as full frame depending on the camera. But in most cases, in my opinion, you'll be fine. And here's why. Because in most cases, you're gonna have control enough of the lighting to where it's not gonna be an issue for you. You're not gonna be shooting in pitch black situations. You don't need the Sony king of low light in order to get most shots. The situations I've had where this has been a struggle has been like an outdoor wedding where they're doing the final walk to their getaway car at night, and the only light available are the sparklers because there's no exterior lights. But in situations like that, you can always bring an extra light or something like that. And in most studio settings or settings where you have control over the lighting, then the low light is going to be perfectly fine to get you what you need, as long as you know what you're doing. And I'm sure the new Sony FX30, which is an APS-C camera, I believe, I'm sure that's still going to have even better low light for a crop sensor camera because Sony is just really good at that. So now it comes down to cost. My GH5 setup with the Metabone Speed Booster with the Sigma 18 to 35 all adds up to a total of about $2,500, which is the same price for the A7 IV body only. That's not even counting lenses or anything like that. So your budget is going to go much further with a crop sensor camera, in my opinion, especially when you consider the glass available for them. There's much more variety in lens selection available to Micro Four Thirds sensors than there are on most of the full frames, and what is available is going to be cheaper because it's a smaller setup. Sony E-mount has lots of good third-party options, but if you're looking at like the Panasonic S5 Mark II or something like that, any other full frame lines, there's not quite as much selection available on the market yet, especially when it comes to third-party as well. So something to keep in mind there that will affect the cost of everything. And another overall pro that I haven't mentioned yet is just the size of a crop sensor camera. Unless you're carrying around something really beefy like that Sigma 18 to 35, then most lenses on a crop sensor camera are just going to be smaller, lighter. You're going to be able to put them on gimbals better. You can save money there. It'll take up less room in your camera back. It'll be easier on your back. So make sure you don't overlook that. So with all that said, that'll do it for me in this video today. I'm sure there's other things that I missed, so put down in the comments other things that you would add to this conversation that I didn't bring up, and hopefully this has been helpful to you, helps inform your decision, give you some good comparisons, and maybe surprise you a little bit with what you're able to do if you know what you're doing on a crop sensor camera. So thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe if this was helpful to you, like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.